I want to spend a few minutes on this case study because I think it's interesting and I think it ties some of the concepts we've talked about so far together. This is a biotronic. This patient is actually, I'll show the electrogram in a second, but this is a CRTD patient, but it's actually a DX lead. So there's no atrial pacing, but there is atrial sensing. So that's why they're programmed to a VDD mode, and the base rate is 50, max tracking rate of 120. And some things I want to call your attention to, the histograms primarily. So if you look at this histogram, and Keith mentioned this a moment ago, you see this big clump of atrial sensing and ventricular pacing right around that 120 at that 120 rate bucket. So that's interesting. Definitely want to look into, what's causing that. And then we have a decreased 5V pacing percentage. This one's 66%. So of course we want to figure out what's causing that decrease in pacing percentage. We'll notice that the PMT counter, so Biotronic doesn't record PMT episodes, but in certain devices, there is the PMT counter. This is showing that they've had no PMTs. PVARP is already programmed to 350, which is pretty long. Biotronic also has this parameter called the VA criterion. And basically what that means is in order for an episode to be classified as PMT, the VA interval during the tachycardia needs to be less than this programmed VA criterion. So here it's 350. Another thing I'll point out is that the max trigger rate is programmed to 110. And this parameter is also tied to the maximum LV pacing rate. So this is saying that the fastest the device will LV pace is 110, which is different than the max tracking rate of 120, which is a little bit interesting. So if we look at this strip, again, this patient is programmed VDD. So you can see first complex, we're asensing by V pacing normally, and then the sinus node just decides to quit on us. So we can't atrial pace in a VDD mode. So we V pace by V pace at the lower rate limit. And that desynchronization of your atria and ventricle allows for retrograde conduction, right? So on this by V pace, we have that retrograde P wave, which then initiates this patient into PMT. So a couple of things that are interesting on this strip is that this was never classified as PMT. And why is that? So really what's happening here is that retrograde conduction time is just a little bit longer than the programmed VA criterion. So this patient is having, and if you look through this patient's remote monitoring report, they're having all kinds of hundreds of these CRT pacing interrupt episodes where we're losing by V pacing. And it's because this patient is constantly going into PMT that's going undetected. So this is a patient where we actually see it very clearly in our histograms. It's impacting their BIV pacing. And again, if we look at what's going on in the LV, we're not pacing because the RV pacing is happening at the max tracking rate and the LV is programmed in a way that it can't keep up. So a lot of things going on here. So, what do we do when we identify this? We fix the trigger. In this case, the trigger is the VDD pacing. So we can't really fix that problem unless we, add an atrial lead that allows for atrial pacing, which is obviously very invasive. But we're trying to increase the BIV pacing percentage, so it's probably a consideration. Increasing the base rate may or may not help, probably not, because again, what we're losing here is the AV synchrony. So fixing the trigger, not super clear cut in this example, but what I think you could do is lengthen PVARP. Of course, we always talk about that as an option, but our retrograde conduction time is very long, so we'd have to make our PVARP, and it's already 350, so we can maybe make it a little bit longer. But what you could do is lengthen that VA criterion, which is something very specific to Biotronic. If we lengthen that to say, I think the longest we can go is 500, maybe lengthen it to 400. Now that VA timing will be less than the VA criterion, which will allow the PMT termination algorithm to be satisfied, which will allow then the termination algorithm to kick in. So this is kind of a multifaceted case study, but I wanted to make sure we talked about it because of the decrease in BIV pacing, the histograms. Really interesting one. Keith or Mark or Greg, I don't know if you had any other input on this one. Sorry, I kind of took over on this one.
No, you're fine. I think the only thing that I would add is yes, extending PVARP would fix this PMT, but if you're throwing your PVARP out to, 400, 450 milliseconds, that's when you're going to run into that functional undersensing that we talked about before. So again, there's always pros and cons. It is a solution to the problem, but it could lead to other problems with atrial sensing and arrhythmia sensing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
I think anytime you see VDD, typically a VDD patient's going to have intact sinus node, but obviously things can always change with the patient. So if you start to have sinus node issues with the patient who is VDD, it's very easy that you're going to lose AV synchrony, and you should be on the lookout for PMTs.
Yeah. So what do you think? I think we can probably go through one more, and I think this one might be a good place to end. So this, another Boston Scientific CRTD. Again, Boston Scientific records these, so we often have a lot of episodes to go through for PMT. So similarly to most of the other episodes, we're seeing this ASense 5E pace sequence at the max tracking rate. If we were to count, I bet we'd have 16 in a row. And then we have this PMT termination algorithm kick in. So Mark, you want to take over with what happens here on this patient? What's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, 16 pacing at max track. So on that 16th one, we see that our PVARP is extended. So we have that ascents falling into refractory, and we're no longer tracking it. Now, this patient's interesting because we're not tracking the ascents, but their intrinsic conduction actually kicks in here. So we have ascents in refractory followed by RV sense and LV sense right there. Now, the next atrial beat, if you look, is still in refractory. So we think what happened on this one, if you look at the A-sense to BIV timing versus the A-sense to RV sense timing right here, when the intrinsic conduction comes in after that PMT algorithm, it looks like that timing window got a little bit longer. So even just that little bit of extra time there causes your PVARP to start just a little bit later, and that was enough to put your following A-sense in refractory. So now that the following A-sense is in refractory, we're not BIV pacing anymore, and now we just have intrinsic conduction coming through. So the PMT algorithm here, and again, it's a false PMT, our atrial rate didn't slow. It actually caused us to stop BIV pacing just from that small little change in AV delay there.
So how would you fix this patient, right? Because we of course don't want to leave the patient without IV pacing. So what could you do here?
So a good one here, and especially since this is a false PMT, I'd probably look at increasing that max track rate, and then your PMT algorithm wouldn't even kick in until a higher rate. And since this patient looks like they get their sinus rate pretty high, it would actually probably provide some better support. Again, taking into account that your timing window won't always allow for that. And again, every patient is different, but that's the first thing I would think of.